أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين الصلاة والسلام على رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Dear brothers and sisters, today I want to talk to you just a little bit about hadiths, the different categories of hadith that are mentioned in the Qur'an, and also why hadiths are so important, because there are certain groups of people that will reject hadiths entirely. And this is something that is not within the Islamic texts and is not within the practice of the Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So here I want to explain to you why, because sometimes it can be a little bit confusing. So a hadith is literally an item of conversation or a saying or a report or a story. So this is what hadith means in its general term. Now, Islamic perspective changed the meanings to mean the sayings and actions of the Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So the ulama view hadith literature as the sayings, actions, approvals, or physical characteristics of the Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So what about the word hadith or its derivatives in the Qur'an? Where do we see this? So the Qur'an itself and hadiths. Now, we see in Surah number 68, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, "Leave me alone with those who reject this communication," or "so leave me with whoever denies the Qur'an." So what this means, and this uses the word hadith, هذا الحديث. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala here is referring to the Qur'an as the words or communication. So this is the first way that the word hadith is presented in the Quranic text. The second way is the historical story. So we know that we have lots of stories within the Quranic text. Why? Because as people, as human beings, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has created us so that we will remember a good story. We will learn morals and values from a good story. Everybody likes a good story, right? So here we can look at, for example, Surah number 20, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us, has the story of Musa, the Prophet Moses, Musa alayhi salam, reached you? Hadithu Musa. So this is the second way in which the word hadith is mentioned in the Quranic text. The third way in which the word hadith is mentioned in the Quranic text is actually a general conversation. So here let's look at Surah 66, where the Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam has confided in one of his wives in this particular story. And here it says, Azwajihi hadithan. So we have the word hadith again, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is describing how the Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam has confided in one of his wives, has spoken to one of his wives in confidence. So the hadith itself is a source of divine guidance, and this is something that we shouldn't forget. Although there are different types of hadiths, hadiths are from the Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam divine guidance. How do we know? Let's go back to the Quranic text as our evidence. Surah 53 mention that the Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam does not speak from his desires. Indeed, what he says is revelation. In Arabic, it says wahyun yuha. It means that this is revelation that has been revealed. So in order for us to be able to practice Islam properly, we need both the Quranic text and the hadith literature as well. Let me explain. It's essential, for example, when we know how to pray, we know that the Qur'an tells us to pray. But actually, when we look at the hadith literature, this tells us actually how to pray, what the prayer looks like. Now, if we're going to reject hadith literature, then how do we know how to pray? The Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam tells us, pray as you have seen me pray. Moral conduct, for example, we see this in the hadith literature. So the character of the Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, again we see this connected back to the Quranic text. Aisha radiallahu anha reported that the character of the Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam was the Qur'an. In essence, he is the walking Qur'an. What about religious conduct and thinking about how we do things with religiosity? how things look as human beings, that we need more than the words of the Qur'an. We need that practical application, which can only come in the form of the hadith literature. And lastly, we can think about the law, the Sharia, and how that is applied. So we have the foundation of the Qur'an, which is our basis, and then the hadith literature, and then those in authority. Now there are debates, scholarly debates about who those in authority may or may not be. There's disagreement on this. But when we look at the hadith literature itself, hadiths were not necessarily written down at the time of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. In fact, there is a hadith prohibiting writing hadith down at the time, that the Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, do not write down what I say. However, even this hadith itself, there is some disagreement. And some narrators, such as Bukhari and others, claimed that it was actually said by Abu Sa'id radhiyallahu anhu. But nevertheless, the writing of hadiths was not done much at the time of the Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. The hadith literature was memorized. But remember, we are living here in a time now where we are relying on text. We rely on reading. But look how things are shifting back to many people are learning by listening to lectures such as this. So we're moving back to an oral tradition. At the time of the Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, pretty much all learning was done through oral tradition. People would listen. They had very excellent memories, much better than we have now. They would be able to retain information. And this is one of the miracles of the Qur'an, of course, that actually, unusually, and really the only other text that was normally written at the time, and even then not so much, was the literature of poetry at the time. But we see that the Qur'an was written down at the time and recorded. So although hadiths were not written down at the time, they were recorded in people's memories. And when they were collected later on, this became a necessity because members of the Sahaba radhiyallahu anhum were passing away, there were wars happening, and actually they needed writing down. But even from the time, there are some reports that Abdullah ibn Amr radhiyallahu anh and others did write some of the hadiths of the Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and indeed some of the khutbahs that he gave, the sermons that he gave down as well, even at the time. But when we move forward in time, about the 1st century after Hijrah, we're at the time of the Tabi'een. So we have the Sahaba and the Tabi'een. So the Tabi'een are the generation after the Sahaba, after the companions. Islam had spread, and people unfortunately had begun to fabricate hadiths. So they were making hadiths up essentially. Now, why did fabrication of hadith happen? It happened because sects were evolving and governing parties weren't always particularly honest, and they needed to justify some of the policies to the masses, to the people. And so what they would do is they would either make up a hadith, or they would sometimes change genuine hadiths. So they might change particular words within that hadith. And they would do this to create exaggeration or to change the meaning so it suited their own narrative. So this unfortunately was happening at the time, about 100 years or so after the Hijrah. And of course there were different political groups. That we have the different political groups between Ali, Muawiyah and Aisha radhiyallahu anhum, and others people say that this fabrication of hadiths even started around the time of the Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So what about the recording of hadiths? So Az-Zuhri radhiyallahu anh was really the first to record narrators and their honesty, so their integrity. But by the 3rd century after Hijrah, hadiths were actually measured for accuracy, and they were grouped together into what we see today. You might get Sahih, you might get something that is Mutawatir, and all these different categories of hadiths. So this is the first short lecture, just to give you an introduction to the science of hadiths, inshallah ta'ala. We are going to, inshallah, be talking a little bit about the An Nawawis Arba'un, the An Nawawis 40 hadiths, and go through a little bit of the tafsir of those hadith in some of our future lectures, inshallah ta'ala. I hope you've enjoyed this lecture. Jazakumullah khair. From me, Ustadha Amina Blake. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.